In this tutorial, I want to talk about the difference between exposing for skin tones and exposing for the background in an image. Now, this is something I talk about a lot in many of my tutorials. And basically, to understand this, I want to go back and talk about how the camera light meter works. So when you're using a camera light meter and you point the camera at your subject, it's metering for an average. So if you've got your camera set to automatic, basically what the camera meter is doing is it's reading the reflected light that is coming from your subject. And so this can cause some problems. So what the camera is always trying to do is give you an average setting. It's going to give you an exposure that will give you an okay skin tone and an okay background. But it becomes problematic when, let's say, you've got a very bright background, and if you expose, the camera metering system might get confused by all the light that's reflecting from behind your model. In another instance, you may have an image that's very, very dark. So you might have someone in a dark room wearing a dark suit. The camera is going to meter that image and try and give you the average reading, and you'll end up with an image that looks overexposed. Now, the thought process behind exposing for a skin tone or exposing for the background basically comes down to taking control of your camera settings, going on to manual mode and deciding, pre-visualizing how you want your image to look. And let's first talk about exposing for skin tones and in what situations I would use this. So let's have a look at this image here. And I've got someone standing in front of a backlit area. So the background is very bright. Now, if I was wanting to expose for the background in this image, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my focus point, which is also the way the camera measures light, and I'm going to move it to the background of the image and say over the sky, and I will now stop down until I get an image where my background looks correct. And this is if I've taken into consideration that when I do this portrait, I want the background to be a feature of this portrait and I want to see all the detail in the background. Now you can see the problem that I'm faced with is once I get my background looking right, my subject is underexposed. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can deal with this. I can take this image into, say, Lightroom or Photoshop, and I can lift the shadows. I can edit the image and bring out the skin tone. It's not always ideal because when you're underexposing skin tones, you're going to get a lot of extra noise in the subject. But it can be done, and this is a technique that can work. However, the other option that you can go for if you're doing a setup like this is you can introduce some fill light to your image. So I've got my background looking the way I want it, but my subject is underexposed. So I can either bring in a continuous light or some fill flash or a reflector. And what I'm doing is now adding light to that image and bringing up the exposure. So you can see step one, set up my shot, decide how I want my frame to look, and then I take a reading for the background, and then I decide how I want my skin tone to look. Is this something I want to do in post-production, or do I have the opportunity to add either fill flash or a reflector to this image to get the desired result? If I'm exposing for the highlights, this is a situation where, like, same situation here, and I've got my background, and let's say that I'm going for a more high fashion look and the background isn't going to be important in this image. So what I can do is I bring my focus point over the skin tone. on the face. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my, open up my aperture or change my shutter speed or even increase my ISO until the skin tone looks good. And to me, generally, when it's heavily backlit by like this image here, what I'll need to do is increase by, say, 1 to 1.5 stops, and you're going to get a really beautiful looking skin tone. But it's at the expense of the background. So the background will blow out, but in most instances, when you're going for that fashion look, you see this a lot in editorial magazines. You see it a lot in models' folios. You can use this technique when you're shooting senior portraits. You can use it for headshots. Don't worry about the background. Just let it go. If you want to avoid having situations like this where you get like a white hot skies and you don't like that, then look for locations where you've got like a lot more structure in the background. And so then when you open up and expose for the skin tone, you lose your background, but there will still be a sense of something or some detail there. So that's something that I might often do if I want to shoot in this manner, or just let the background go, and you'll have a beautifully exposed skin tone, and you'll have a lot less detail in the background. Taking control of the way you expose your images in this way is a complete game changer. You're calling the shots now. How do I want my shot to look? Do I want to create a beautiful daylight image where the skin tone is king in my image, therefore I'm exposing for the skin tone and letting the background go? Or is the background an important factor in this image and I want to include all the detail in the background, but therefore I need to work out a way to add back light into this shot to bring out the skin tone? So I can either do that using post-production, not ideal, or some kind of additional fill, which could be a reflector or fill flash to achieve the result. And it's not just limited to portraits. You can take control of the way you expose your images to create a completely different look to your images. So here's an image here on the streets of Glasgow, and you can see there's a little pocket of sunlight illuminating the door. Now, where I choose to expose this frame, the way I choose to expose this frame is going to have a huge impact on the overall outcome of the shot. If I choose to expose for the shadow details, which is this area around here where there's the shadows on the wall, I'm going to get a much flatter, less contrast in the image, and I'm going to have detail in my shadows and detail in my highlights. But simply by changing my point of focus and only exposing for the highlights in this image gives me a completely different look. And now I've let the shadows go. They're going to go to black, crunch those shadows, and I've gone for something a bit more creative, a far more arty look where I'm highlighted that bike rider, I've got detail in the shadows, and let the rest go to black. So pre-visualize your image. How do you want your image to look? Take control of the settings and decide on how you want your highlights to look and how you want your shadows to look, and whether the background is king or the skin tone is king in this shot.